Welcome to episode 21 of my guide to video game history. It's January 1993 and Sega announced that they were starting to work on a brand new 32-bit console called the Project Aurora, which would blow any of the current systems out of the water, being both a CD console and a 2D gaming powerhouse. And with the Sega CD add-on recently released, the Genesis and Mega Drive sales were doing fantastically well in America and Europe, with the Nintendo SNES console and its games being seen by many Western teenage kids of the time as too childlike, unlike the Sega machine, which seemed cool and edgier. It seemed at the time that Sega would own the gaming market, with its dominance in the arcades, and with only having to entice a stronger foothold in the Japanese market, it all looked so perfectly simple and clear. Then, in November 1993, there were two announcements detailing new consoles to be designed to enter the next-gen race. First was Nintendo, who announced their new console and their partnership with Silicon Graphics, whose high-end specialist PCs have been used in movies such as Terminator 2 and Jurassic Park films. This announcement by Nintendo was not unexpected, as Sega and Nintendo had long been console rivals. But then there was another announcement which took the industry by surprise, when Sony announced that they would also be entering the gaming market, and with the Sony company at the time giving a turnover of $20 billion and still riding high on its Sony Walkman and other electronic gadgets, the industry knew that Sony had the finance and weight to become a serious contender. Since Sony's disastrous partnership with Nintendo to make a CD add-on peripheral combi console called the PlayStation fell through, Sony was of course angry and embarrassed by the incident, and was now pulling out all the stop, with Ken Kutaraji and 250 people working on Sony's own console. And with Sony sinking $500 million, they were determined to design a console that would beat any console currently released. Meanwhile, Sega's early development of their new console would be fraught with confusion, with Sega not wanting to totally alienate its existing user base, and so confusingly decided to work on two variants of the console at the same time, with one being a CD-based console, now called the Saturn, and with the other being a cartridge-based console called the Jupiter, which would be an entry-level console that could be turned into a Saturn-compatible device via an add-on CD peripheral for the machine. But after months of wasted development, Sega finally realised that this two-prong console release and the selling of different versions of the games would be a logistical nightmare, and so dropped the Jupiter console project only to concentrate on the Saturn console. However, not wanting to lose their wasted effort on the Project Jupiter, they instead turned it into a new project called Mars, which would act as an upgrade for the Sega Genesis and Mega Drive. This add-on would become known as the 32X, or Super 32X in Japan, and with it only being released 2 weeks before the planned release of the Saturn. Consequently, Sega had been really stretching itself, with a myriad of consoles being released, such as the Mega Drive, the Mega CD, the Game Gear, the Pico, the 32X, the Sega Nomad, and, of course, the Saturn as well. And all of these game systems would be non-compatible game-wise with each other, and so diluting the Sega marketing and confusing the gamers. Then, as the months progressed through to mid-1994, Sony announced that their console would be ready in late 1994, being much sooner than anyone had expected, and so to be released at the same time as the planned Sega console. And if that weren't enough, rumours from developers working on the Sony machine began to reach the ears of Sega. These rumours were that the Sony PlayStation was an incredible, powerful console and geared towards 3D gaming, and so in many respects being much more a powerful console to what Sega was working on. In addition to all this, Sony, realising the mistakes of the 3DO and Jaguar, started to make sure they had lots of third-party game support, and with a highly reasonable $10 licensing rate per game and impressive hardware, they began winning such prestigious game publishers to their ranks, such as Namco, Capcom and KONAMI, all of whom had been previously frustrated with the stringent mechanisms and high licensing charges that Nintendo had placed upon them, and saw Sony as finally a Japanese rival that would finally give real competition to Nintendo in Japan. Plus, the Sony machine was impressive. As Peter Stone at KONAMI UK put it at the time, Sony showed us this demo back in January 1994. It was only running at half speed, but even then we came out of that meeting with our jaws on the floor. Sega president Hayao Nakayama, on hearing the news, was furious and marched down to the development team and ridiculed them for their previous efforts and being beaten by a company who had little previous experience in designing game consoles. The development team's response was to delay the release of the Saturn by a couple of months, while they frantically incorporated a new video processor into the console, designed to make the Sega Saturn even stronger with its 2D capabilities, but more importantly be much better at doing 3D texture mapping for 3D games. But all this made the machine incredibly hard to program for, with a 2 CPU design and lots of custom chips for developers to contend with. But in Japan, where the Mega Drive and other consoles were very minimal, Sega would concentrate on winning the console war against Sony with the Saturn, and so bombarded the Japanese media with a major marketing campaign, knowing that they needed at least 50% of the market share to be viable to major third-party developers. So on the 22nd of November 1994, Sega would release the Sega Saturn in Japan for 44,800 yen, about £290 or $500. It was met with massive hysteria, with long queues of excited gamers, and with all 200,000 machines made available sold on day one. Sega may have rushed to market to beat Sony, and so only have one real game worthwhile on release, but when that game was Yu Suzuki's Virtua Fighter, which was the most popular arcade game in Japan at the time, and with legions of Japanese gamers obsessed with the game. So, when a home conversion done by the man himself, anticipation in Japan was almost paramount. The game sold for 7,800 yen, about £50, and was impressive as well, with Edge magazine giving it 9 out of 10. They did note that the graphics polygons, which were actually distorted sprites, would occasionally disappear and reappear, but stating that the conversion has all the pulling power of the arcade, being impressed with the graphics of the swooping camera. Then, on the 3rd of December 1994, Sony would release their new console, the Sony PlayStation, for the cheaper 39,000 yen, about £263 or $417. The launch itself in Japan was a much more muted affair, with the console selling well, but without the same levels of anticipation by gamers. But it was a tremendous piece of kit, with its looks bearing many striking similarities to the Super Famicom, from its grey finish and with the PlayStation logo that retained the red, green, yellow and blue, reminiscent of the Super Famicom logo and controller. The Sony controller as well bore a similarity to the Super Famicom controller, being the same layout of buttons, with only 2 extra shoulder buttons given to the design. But the console had some neat touches as well, with mini memory cartridge slots to make game saving and transferring saved data a breeze, and they did clever routines to make faster CD data transfer than other CD consoles at the time. Like the Saturn, there was only one real title worth having on launch, but then that game was Ridge Racer by Namco, selling for 5,800 yen, about £37 or $58, and it was an impressive home conversion, being an almost perfect home port of the arcade racer, with luscious 3D visuals all running at a smooth 30 frames per second. Especially impressive when you consider that Namco managed to do the game in 6 months, and that included learning the new console to be ready for the PlayStation launch. Edge magazine gave the game 9 out of 10, stating that it was the killer app for selling the PlayStation console by the bucket load, but also noting that there was no lasting challenge with the game, with it being too easy to finish. Tom Kalinske, CEO of Sega of America, meanwhile, was concerned with the high price point of about $399 for the Sega Saturn, and that was with no profit to Sega themselves. He felt that it was going to be too expensive, and they would alienate their existing massive user base of Genesis owners. Therefore, in November 1994, they instead decided to pull out all the stops for releasing the 32X for $159, adding more confusion to gamers and game developers alike. A few months later, on the 10th of May, staff at many of the electronic and toy stores across America began secretly stocking their shelves with Sega Saturns. Meanwhile, the following day, gaming press and gamers alike gathered at a newly created exhibition called the Electronics Entertainment Expo, or E3 exhibition. Excited to see firsthand the Sony and Sega new consoles and gain more details about the Sega 2nd of September launch and Sony's yet to be announced launch date. Sony went first, proudly announcing to the gaming press in the world that their release date would be on the 9th of September, directly to take on the Saturn. But the following day, Sega announced to an astounded conference that the 2nd of September launch date was actually a decoy, and in fact Sega had secretly rolled out their Saturns across America to 1,800 stores that were already on sale, selling for $399 or $449 with the Virtua Fighter game. There were also 2 worthwhile launch titles to join the Fighter in the US lineup. There was Daytona Racing USA, another Yu Suzuki game, another hugely popular game in the arcades. Edge gave this game 8 out of 10, noting that although AM2 had managed to replicate the coin-op tolerably well, Saturn's Daytona fails to capture that arcade experience that the PlayStation's Ridge Racer so convincingly delivers. Although there's no single factor that cripples it, but it's the accumulation of niggles which ensures that it never manages to reach its full potential. The other launch title was Panzer Dragoon, which was a brilliant game, with it being a gorgeous on-rail shooter where you flew on top of a dragon and shot enemies in all directions. This was a wonderful game with fantastically unique art style and a hugely enjoyable shooter. Electronic Games Monthly gave the game 8.37 out of 10 and voted it Saturn's Game of the Year for 1995. Europe would see the Saturn released in July 1995, with a smattering of additional titles, such as a platformer, Clockwork Knight, a 3D-looking platformer. The Sony PlayStation would release their console on September the 9th, 1995 in the US and gained a lot of interest, with it being cheaper than the Saturn at $299, and with additional titles such as Battle Arena Toshinden, Rayman, and American sport titles such as NBA Jam Tournament Edition and ESPN Extreme Sports joining the ranks, meaning there was something for everyone. The lower price points of the games as well, thanks to Sony's low royalty take, also helped with its popularity. Europe saw its release of the Sony PlayStation a few weeks later, and it would become hugely popular thanks mainly to one new launch title game. The title was called Wipeout, and it was done by Liverpool-based Psygnosis, who had previously made a name for itself on the Amiga, releasing such titles as Shadow the Beast games and Lemmings. But many of their best games weren't actually by themselves, and instead by other developers. So when Sony paid $30 million for the company, it did raise a few eyebrows in the industry, with many seeing it as a poor purchase for Sony. That all changed, however, when Psygnosis released Wipeout to coincide with a European launch. The game was a brainchild of artist Jim Bowers and designer Nick Burkham, and was set in a futuristic Formula One setting, taking inspiration from the Amiga game called Power Drone, and of course the Nintendo games F-Zero and even Mario Kart. But it was the exhilarating speeds in the game and the stylized visual combined with the star-studded musical lineup of tracks by Left Field, the Chemical Brothers and Orbital, all added to the thrilling game experience. Sony marketing in Europe began showing the game in the club scenes across the UK, seeing how the game might appeal to clubbers as it contained many popular music tracks, and hopefully enticing many gamers that had perhaps moved away from gaming as they grew older. And with games such as this, it gave Sony finally a cool overtone, an edgier feel to the console, with them being able to play Sega at their own game, making Sega now seem more like the kid-like console. This marketing ploy worked really well, with non-gamers and gamers alike were beginning to flock to the Sony device. Edge magazine gave the game 8 out of 10, noting the simplified championship structure, but saying it was hard to criticise such a beautifully realised and well-produced product that exploits the PlayStation power so well. 2 more Wipeout games would be released on the PlayStation. There was Wipeout 2097, or Wipeout XL as it was known in the US, which came out in late 1996 and improved the tracks and music lineup even further, and there was Wipeout 3 in 1999, which rounded off the trilogy nicely. Notably, the Saturn would also see the first 2 games released on its console as well. Through 1996, Sega and Sony would be in direct competition, releasing quality titles of the machines, with the Saturn hosting a brilliant home port of Sega Rally. Developer Treasure doing a great sequel to Gunstar Heroes called Guardian Heroes, which this time took the scrolling beat-em-up and improved it with RPG elements, story and versus mode. There was also Bug, a 3D platformer, and of course they released Virtua Fighter 2, greatly improving upon the original. And also they released Panzer Dragoon 2 Zwei, which was again another great sequel follow-up to the original classic. Then there was a fantastic Nights into Dreams by the Sonic team. This was a wonderfully surreal game as you flew around the levels with Sega's new analog controller. They also gave the game away with Christmas nights in various console bundles, and even giving it away with certain game magazines such as the Sega Saturn magazine for Christmas. It may have been only 2 levels, but with a beautifully realised Christmas themes, it was fantastically enjoyable to play. They also did the Saturn Bomberman, which is simply the best version of the game ever released, and Sega Ages Volume 1, which took the best arcade ports that were being individually released in Japan of Outrun, Afterburner and Space Harrier in one neat package. But over on the PlayStation, the game lineup would also be strong, with Capcom releasing their new game called Resident Evil, with director Shinji Mikami, who up until then was best known for his work of Aladdin and Goof Troop, and better known today for Killer 7 and Vanquish game. And he was joined by the relatively new designer Hideki Kamiya, who has gone on to do such classic games as the Devil May Cry game, Viewful Joe, Okami, and most recently Bayonetta. The game was inspired by the 1992 Alone in the Dark game and the previous 1989 Capcom obscure title called Sweet Home on the NES. In the game you play a Raccoon Police Department Special Tactics and Rescue Service, or STARS team, sent in to discover what happened to the last team sent in. The game was great, being quite spooky in places, and with an enjoyable zombie-related storyline as you uncover the work of the dastardly Umbrella Company. Sony also released their own game character called Crash Bandicoot that was designed to rival the Sonics and Marios of the world. It wasn't as good, to be quite honest, but it was enjoyable enough, and it did become an unofficial mascot of the PlayStation machine. It should be noted at this time, in July 1996, that the long-anticipated Nintendo console would be released at this time in Japan, and it did much to replace Sega as the main competitor to Sony, with Sega being relegated to a clear third. But I will cover this beautiful machine in the next episode. But the big game released was in November 1996, and the game was called Tomb Raider, designed by UK Derby-based Core Design, who had made a name for themselves on the Amiga and Sega machines, releasing such fabulous games such as Switchblade, Rick Dangerous, Bubba and Sticks, Chuck Rock, Heimdall, But for the Saturn and PlayStation, they would surpass themselves, fully embracing the world of 3D with the aristocratic female bombshell called Lara Croft, who was part Indiana Jones and part James Bond. The game was the brainchild of Tony Garb and a team of core veterans. The game took the heroine on a quest to find in the Lost Tomb a mysterious artifact called the Scion. The game was brilliant, involving the perfect balance of adventure, platform and puzzles. And with such a cool main character, she quickly became the new cooler face of gaming, to be licensed on many products and a worldwide phenomenon. For myself, I remember playing this game around a friend's house, and after about 30 minutes play, I rushed to the nearest shop and bought it, as I was simply blown away by the gaming experience. Of course, such success brings sequels, and so Core came out with almost yearly updates, and so quickly the Tomb Raider series began to get tarnished by becoming complacent and a bit stale. Through to 1997 and 1998, it was again definitely Sony's year, with a stack of great novel games gracing the console. There was Nana Osha's Parappa the Rapper, an insanely cute and addictive rhythm action-based game where you played a dog who has to rap well by pressing the buttons at the correct times to progress. The game was wonderful, with its unique look and brilliant humorous raps for you to work your way through. But of course, the big game that everyone was salivating for was Final Fantasy by Yoshinori Kitase, who worked at Square, who had jumped ship from Nintendo to join the Sony ranks. And the game didn't disappoint, with wonderful visuals and truly masterful story by Kazushige Nojima that made it for many Westerners their first tender steps into the Final Fantasy series. A further 2 sequels would be released for the PlayStation, with Final Fantasy VIII in 1999 and Final Fantasy IX in 2000, taking the story still further. Other notable classics was Konami's sublime update of the Castlevania series, called Castlevania Symphony of the Night. It flew in the face of current gaming trends, with it still being 2D, and so consequently with the powerful PlayStation hardware became the best in the series. Then there was Oddworld, Abe's Odyssey, a wonderfully unique and bizarre humorous puzzle platformer where you played a slave alien called Abe, who after discovering that he and his fellow slaves are to be killed, sets about helping them all escape. This was a fun, unique game with some really good puzzles thrown in for good measure. Another title that should be mentioned was Grand Theft Auto, made by UK-Scottish-based developer DMA Design, who had previously made a name for themselves, releasing the game Lemmings. They are now, of course, known as Rockstar North, and still doing fantastically well with their Grand Theft Auto games and titles such as Red Dead Redemption. But for their first game in the GTA series, it was a humorous top-down city-based game which gained popularity through it being totally open-ended, allowing you to do whatever you wanted in the game as you followed the gangster-themed story. The music as well was wonderful, with a collection of tunes played over 7 radio stations, adding to the fun still further. But the big game on PlayStation in December 1997 was Gran Turismo, by in-house developer Polyphony Digital and the genius director Kazunori Yamauchi at the helm. They had originally cut their teeth on the poorly received Mario-inspired racer Motor Toon Grand Prix, which was one of the early launch games for the machine. But when the new game Gran Turismo was released, it took the world by storm, and it perhaps would be the final death knell to the Sega Saturn. I remember myself enjoying other racing titles at the time, such as Porsche Boxster and V-Rally, and thinking that racing couldn't get any better. Then I was in Blockbusters, and I saw on the display TVs a new game showing replays of the Gran Turismo game. My flatmate bought the game and we were blown away by this quality simulation racer, marvelling at the stacks of real licensed cars in the game and the sublime handling. I was also impressed with the collection of background rock tunes by bands such as Ash, garbage and David Bowie that perfectly complemented the racer. Of course, leading into 1998, Sega would release 3 masterful titles showing what the system could do, with Shining Force 3, a great strategy RPG, Panzer Dragoon Saga, the third and the best by a mile in the Dragoon series, offering RPG elements as well as the shooting mix. Finally, there was Radiant Silvergun by Treasure, which was a platinum hard but undeniably beautiful vertical blaster. They were all great games, but sadly by 1998 it was clear, with Sony and Nintendo stealing the market for themselves, Sega knew that they had lost the console battle, and so, being financially hit hard and reducing its workforce by a third, they officially announced that they would stop support of the Saturn as they were working on a new console. Understandably, this upset many of their loyal gamers who had stuck by their machine, only to find out that a couple of years later they would stop support, and it caused a lot of bad will from game publishers and gamers alike. Of course, Sony, now heralded the clear console winner, would continue to have some classic games released through 1998 for it, with such gems as Metal Gear Solid by developer Hideo Kojima for KONAMI, who started his series back on the MSX2 in 1987. He would go on to create a cult following with other great adventure titles such as Snatcher and the Japanese-only Police Noughts, which had been released a couple of years earlier on the PlayStation and Saturn. But it was with his follow-up to the Metal Gear Solid games in September 1998 that he would hit true worldwide fame. The game released on the PlayStation was the third in the series, called Metal Gear Solid, and involved you playing a grizzled saboteur called Solid Snake, as you stealthily infiltrated the enemy building to overthrow your nemesis Liquid Snake. Another classic in October 1998 was done by former developer MILLENNIUM, which was now a subsidiary company of Sony and called SCE Cambridge, which is most famous today, of course, for their little Big Planet games. They had previously made a name for itself with the James Bond games, but on the PlayStation they would work on a new platformer called Medieval, which put you in the role of Dead Knight Sir Daniel Fortescue, a knight brought back as believed he was a great warrior who could finally defeat the evil wizard Zarok. The game was great, with stacks of humour and with an art style that heavily inspired by Night Before Christmas, and well worth tracking down and playing if you haven't tried this before. A sequel did follow in 2000, which continued the story even further. A further 2 games well worth a look at on the PlayStation was the horror game Silent Hill, released by KONAMI. That was, in my opinion, the first truly terrifying game, especially with the villain Pyramid Head. And there was a brilliant racer called Driver by Newcastle UK developer Reflections, who had previously released the classic Shadow the Beast games and Demolition Derby before releasing this superb game. In the game you play an undercover cop who joins a criminal organisation as a wheelman. What followed would be a fantastic illegal ride across 4 American cities, as you finally got to relive for yourself all those car chases we'd seen in the movies. The PlayStation would continue to be supported right up until 2006. Making it by far the longest supported console of all time. Of course, over such a long period, there were so many classic games that would be released, and far too many to be mentioned here. Anyway, look out for my next episode where we look at the other console that joined the party late in June 1996, the Nintendo 64, and what was happening in the world of PC gaming at this time. So, until next time, see you later.